Today we will be talking about the global biodiversity crisis, specifically pertaining to the decline of birds in North America. If you are not familiar with the biodiversity crisis, it is a continuous loss of species, their habitats, and ecosystems. Overall, this is threatening the balance of nature by causing species to go extinct, which then is creating a domino effect, hurting the health of our planet. Some of these species and places at risk are mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish, plants, and many more. It is mainly taking place in areas where humans reside. These human-made issues consist of pollution, climate change, habitat destruction, and invasive species. When looking in on the loss of these birds, it's important to note the different factors that contribute to this issue. Poaching is basically the act of illegally hunting animals occupying land that is not owned by that specific person. These birds are used for display purposes and many other reasons, which decreases the population density of them in ecosystems. Resource depletion is also another important factor, and this is a direct effect of humans and birds sharing a space, similar to what Lexi mentioned in the previous slide. The overconsumption of humans limits what is available to the birds, and this is a serious problem. The human desire for urban development and deforestation for economic purposes leads to a habitat loss for these birds. Climate change is the most significant factor as it changes the conditions in which these birds live and have adapted to, leaving these organisms in a state of shock. Lastly, all forms of pollution can contribute to this loss of biodiversity.
Biodiversity loss has many effects on everything around us. When it pertains to wildlife populations and communities, it creates a decline of these populations and possible extinctions. It also destabilizes our ecosystems by disrupting the natural balance, which makes more populations vulnerable to loss. In ecosystem services, it reduces essential services to us like water purification, climate regulation, and food production. When it pertains to humans, it limits our food sources, vital medicine, pollution, and increased risk of disease. Some of the questions this article tries to address is if the population declines could it also be reversed in the future? Does population loss only affect rare species, or does it also affect common species as well? And how much have bird populations in the United States declined over the recent decades? And the way they collect their data is using multiple bird monitoring databases, which analyzes 529 bird species across the United States and Canada, and using NextRad weather radar, which estimates the long-term changes in nocturnal passage of birds through the airspace from 2007 to 2017, and these both figure out the health of the birds and where they're migrating to.
Our first key finding shows the net population change in North American birds. Since 1970, we have seen a net loss of 2.9 billion breeding birds across the continental avifauna. In Figure A on the left, we see in 1970 our change in birds starts at 0 and steadily drops to near -3 in 2010. This figure clearly shows our loss of 2.9 billion birds just in the span of 40 years. This is a 29% loss and represents more than 1 in 4 birds declining from things such as habitat loss, climate change, and unregulated harvest. Figure B shows us the same exact trend, but we can see how each breeding biome affected the birds and during what year the specific biomes became unsuitable for the North American birds. We can see by the dark blue line that the wetlands were a more suitable breeding biome than the beige line showing the grasslands. Figure C shows in more detail the trends of each biome and how much it affected the North American birds. We see again more clearly that the wetlands were a lot more suitable for the North American birds than the grasslands. Figure D gives us the same type of information, but more specifically the proportion of species declining in each biome.
This graph depicts the decline in nocturnal birds migration by airspace from 2007 to 2017. The slope of the line is obviously declining, so in fact, there's actually a 13.6% reduction in biomass passage over the last 10 years, and there are 4 major contributions to this, which is climate change, ecosystem changes, habitat loss, and human activity.
Here is the third key finding. Figure 3 shows that there have been 3.2 billion birds lost since 1970, and only 250 million birds have been gained. The 2 pie charts show the great difference between birds lost versus birds gained. As Jordan and Abby described at the beginning of our presentation, there are many factors leading to the decrease of birds and specific bird species, such as pollution, climate change, habitat destruction, and even more.
This image shows a closer look at the exact number of birds lost and gained. There are 4 groups we can divide birds into: shorebirds, land birds, water birds, and waterfowl. Section D shows the percentage change of each management group. For example, the American sparrows have decreased by roughly 35%. As you can see, the only group that has increased is the waterfowl group. This is most likely caused by conservation efforts for cleaner water.
Now let's dive into how we can address this issue in the bigger picture. Specifically for avifauna, researching specific limiting factors that impact lifespan can allow us to prolong it. If we isolate the spatial limiting factors as well as migration factors, we can identify threats during their annual migratory cycles and counteract them. In addition, understanding the breeding and non-breeding seasons allow us to adapt to potential changes that affect these numbers. Understanding how seasonal interactions drive population change aid us in protecting our biodiversity.
Identifying factors that restrict the growth of biodiversity in an ecosystem, specifically those factors that inhibit the mating behaviors of habitats, is important to stay educated on this issue. It can also prompt the development of laws and legislation that can combat this issue. Lastly, it's important to pass legislation that protects endangered species because they are the species that are close to contributing to this biodiversity loss. Here are all of our references. Thank you so much for listening.